Hi, it's Miss Marsden. I'm going to take you through a lesson today which is recapping everything you've learnt so far in the biology topic, which is ecology. So your first task for today is in the booklet. You need the booklet out of either the email which I've sent around or from folder, and you need to be completing it as we go along. I am constantly going to be referring to it, so you either need an online copy in front of you and a piece of lined paper, or I've made it so you can fill in the booklet on Word as you go along. So your first task is you've got 4 definitions, and I would like you to match each one to the following 4 keywords, which are population, ecosystem, community, and biotic factor. What you can do is you can type the definitions into the table which you've got in your booklet, or you can just number them 1, 2, 3, and 4, and write those correct numbers in the table which is in the booklet. So your ecosystem is an interaction between living organisms and non-living parts of their environment. A community, you need to think about 2 or more populations of living organisms, so 2 or more different species of living organisms living within the same area. And we can refer to a population as all of the organisms of a same species living in an area. You might notice that in our definition for community we have used the term population, and the definition for population is implied within there. A biotic factor, lastly, is a living factor that affects an ecosystem, and I've given you 2 examples. I've said disease and predators. We are going to come back to biotic and abiotic factors later on, so please bear that definition in mind for then. Right then, the outcomes for today's lesson. I want you to describe and explain the function of adaptations. We also need to be able to describe and explain the impacts of climate change, which we've been talking a lot about over the past few weeks. You need to be able to state the differences between both biotic and abiotic factors. And like I said, we've already made a start of that in the Do Now task. And finally, we need to be able to recap the carbon cycle. So take this opportunity, make sure your phone's off, make sure you've got no distractions, then we'll get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at biotic and abiotic factors. So using the definitions from the pictures, I want you to firstly define what abiotic and biotic factors are. Please look back at your answer for the Do Now task, and it will give you a significant clue about one of them. And then what I want you to do in the booklet is I want you to give as many examples as possible. Use the pictures to help you out. So if I was to give one example of a biotic factor, I would use this one, and I would say that that is pathogens, for example, bacteria. So pause the video for as long as you need to come up with your list of both. Right then, I'm quickly going to go through them, but what you need to do once this lesson is over, you need to have a look in the answer booklet, and you can compare the answers in there to what you've come up with as well. So for a biotic factor, that is a living part of an environment. So we've already said pathogens, predators, human interference, so for example hunting, plant life, competition are all examples of biotic factors. So moving over to the right hand side, an abiotic factor is a non-living part of an environment. So you need to be thinking about the weather, temperature, the amount of water, the pH of soil, for example. So compare this to the list I've got, because abiotic factors are slightly more difficult to get your head around. So the more complicated ones there would be the carbon dioxide levels for plants. And you should identify that that's needed for photosynthesis. And oxygen levels for aquatic animals as well is important. We've already talked about the biotic factors, but if there is any you missed, any that you think you wouldn't remember, please write them down. Moving on to the next outcome for today. In your booklets, you've got a similar setup to what I've got on the right here. You need to be able to identify at least 3 things that animals compete for, and then 3 things which plants compete for. So you're thinking about if you have 2 packs of lions, for example, in the same area, what are they going to be competing for? I'll give one example for plants, and I'll say plants compete for water. You need to think of at least 2 more things which both animals and then separately plants compete for, please. I should have mentioned that you should have paused the video there, so if you haven't, please pause it now and then carry on, because I'm going to go through the answers. So animals will compete for, if you like we're going to go back to the example of 2 packs of lions, for example. They'll be competing for food. They need to have enough to eat. They also need enough water, shelter, and they also need enough mates to be able to successfully breed. The plants are slightly different, and we've already said that plants compete for water. Plants also compete for space, minerals. So minerals falls under the nutrients in the soil, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. If you think about that, most of those actually do link to photosynthesis, and that is what a plant needs to do to be able to survive and thrive. Let's move on. So the next thing we're going to talk about is adaptation. So I've got 3 separate categories of adaptations that you need to know about, and I've illustrated them using the pictures on this slide. So we've got the camel, which has got several examples of structural adaptations, a poisonous cobra, which has got an example of a functional adaptation, and then a huddle of penguins, which are demonstrating a behavioural adaptation. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to, using my examples, give the definitions of what behavioural, functional and structural adaptations are. And I'd like you to give some examples of adaptations which fall into each category, remembering that when we're talking about adaptations, we don't just talk about animals, we need to talk about plants as well. If you're struggling with plants to come up with, your good ones to think about are always cactuses. Let's pause the video if you need more time on this. I'm going to go through the answers now. So a structural adaptation basically is any feature which gives an organism an advantage. So it's any physical feature which is going to give that organism an advantage. So if I'm looking at my camel, I've labelled all of the structural adaptations there because I can physically see them, and they are giving that organism an advantage in its environment. So functional adaptation is slightly different. It's a chemical process or a physical process which gives an organism an advantage. So the chemical process that's being highlighted in this one is the fact that a cobra is poisonous. A behavioural adaptation is a change in behaviour of an organism which helps it to survive within its environment. So the behaviour being illustrated in this picture is obviously that the penguins are huddling together for warmth. That protects them from the extreme weather which is going on the outside, and it means that the ones in the middle are more likely to survive. So if I was to come up with some more examples of structural adaptations, I'd think about fur, colour of the fur, thickness of the fur, size of ears, for example, the size of feet, the fact that a cactus has spines, for example, that it has long roots to reach groundwater. They're all examples of structural adaptations because they're all physical features which give it an advantage in its environment. Some more examples of functional. You just need to think about poisons. Photosynthesis within a plant is actually an example of a functional adaptation. Plants which give out sticky sap to trap insects, for example. And behavioural, you could have organisms that are nocturnal, meaning they hunt at night to avoid predators. You could have lizards, for example, that lay in the shade while it's warm. It's any behaviour which increases their chance of surviving. So I'm going to give a specific example now, and we're going to talk about a polar bear. So what I want you to do in the booklet is give 3 adaptations of a polar bear, and then once you've described that adaptation, for example, white fur, say why that is a benefit. For example, white fur helps the polar bear to camouflage. This means it's more likely to catch its prey. Then tell me whether you think they're structural, behavioural or functional adaptations based on the definitions which you have got from the previous task. So there's loads of adaptations that you could have had, and I've just picked out 3. So the first one we went through together, and that is an example of a structural adaptation. Number 2 is also a structural adaptation, as is 3. But the fact that, for example, a polar bear's, when it gets colder, its blood vessels will get smaller to prevent heat loss, that would be an example of a functional adaptation. Polar bears using their paws to break through ice, for example, would be an example of a behavioural adaptation. You don't always need to have all 3, as long as you have clearly and correctly identified what type of adaptation you've given. You don't need to give all 3. So use that as a model answer if you didn't get them. And there's also a space for a stretch task where you can choose your own animal or plant and you can do the same thing. So please feel free to do that, and you can submit it to your teacher and they'll mark it for you. So last one of our outcomes, and this topic that people do tend to trip over a little bit, is the carbon cycle. We have done a lot of practice on this. So what I've done is I've got this diagram which summarises all the processes which are incorporated into the carbon cycle, okay? So each one of the arrows represents a different process, and what you need to do is you need to match up the letters from the diagram with the written descriptions which are below. Please bear in mind that you can have more than one letter in each box. So let's do one together where we've got arrow A going from a tree to the box which says organic compounds in dead organisms. So therefore, logically, we know A is just showing that the plant has died. B, however, is different because B is showing a arrow going from the plant to the cow. So that is showing us that the plant is being eaten by the cow and the carbon has been passed from the tree to the cow. So match each letter to the descriptions in the box. You also need to fill in the gaps. Pause it for as long as you need to. I recommend 3 minutes for this task. So, first box, during photosynthesis, plants remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and that is being shown by arrow H. I'm going to go from left to right, and then I'll do the bottom row. So, during respiration, organisms release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So, I've put letter F, but you also need to take into account that plants also respire, so G needs to go in that box too. So, decay releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as they break down organic compounds. So I've used the word decay there, but the word detritivore will also fit, which basically means worms, woodlouse, etc. So E and D is showing that. So I'm going to the bottom left-hand box, and carbon of fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I'm going to ask you now, do you think that gap is correct? Just pause it and think, does carbon go in that gap? Or do I need the scientific word for burning? Fill it in with what you think. So I shows us that combustion of fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. Combustion meaning burning. That is shown by arrow I. Carbon compounds then pass along the food chain during feeding. B is showing that. Plants and animals die as shown by A and C. Please make sure you fill those gaps in. Please make sure you've matched the correct letters up. What you need to do as a stretch task below is to put this into one paragraph. So I've started the paragraph off for you. What I would do is I would write it out in a paragraph, and that will give you a full description of how carbon is cycled within the atmosphere. There will be a model answer in the answer booklet, so please do have a go at that. I think you will benefit from it massively. If you're still struggling, please do just send an email to your teacher. They'll be happy to talk through it with you. And then the last bit, which I'm not going to spend too much time going through, is talking about climate change and global warming. So you've got space for 3 questions, which are below. What I want you to do firstly is I would like you to have a go at answering these questions independently, using what you've learned in school and in the chemistry topic and in the very recent lessons where we've been talking about this. Those questions are: name the gases that affect the atmosphere, describe what the greenhouse effect is, state the long-term effects of global warming. So have a go at answering them now on your own, and then I'm going to go through them. While I go through them, the expectation is you are making notes as I go along. Now let's annotate them together. Try using a different colour pen so you can recognise what has come from improvements and what you knew at first. So your first question, we're talking about naming the substances. So we've got 3 substances, and I've got the molecular representations of them here. So have a go at telling me what the 3 greenhouse gases are. So on the left, I've got 2 H's, hydrogens, and 1 oxygen, H2O, water vapour. Next one, I've got the big black circle is representing carbon, and I've got 4 hydrogens. I've got CH4, that's methane. And then the one at the bottom, I've got C and 2 O's, CO2, that's carbon dioxide. So I've got water vapour, methane, and carbon dioxide. Now we need to talk about how those 3 greenhouse gases contribute to the greenhouse effect. So greenhouse gases in the atmosphere maintain temperatures on Earth to be able to support life. So the greenhouse effect isn't entirely man-made, it is a naturally occurring phenomena. The only effect that humans have is to make this effect worse. It's making it more apparent. Without humans, it would still exist. We do need it. It is a good thing. But when that layer of greenhouse gases gets too thick, that's where the problem comes from. Humans are making more carbon dioxide, more methane. That's where the problem comes from, okay? So don't get confused thinking it's entirely man-made. Basically, the sun emits shortwave radiation. If you follow the arrows down, some of that radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface and it warms it. We need some of it to be absorbed. We need it to warm up because that allows plants to live, that allows everything else to live. Some of it, however, is re-emitted from the surface of the Earth. And you can see that it's re-emitted and it's going back out into space. So remembering that this is now longer wave radiation, some of it you can see is getting trapped by the layer. And you can see by the big arrow on the right, which is bouncing back to the Earth's surface, that the trapped radiation that is continually reflected back to the Earth's surface and it causes it to warm. So the more of this radiation that gets trapped by this layer, the warmer the Earth will get. If this layer gets thicker, more radiation gets trapped, the warmer the Earth's surface gets. So what's the effect of this? You need to know 4 changes really. I've split it into the booklets in terms of an impact on humans and an impact on ecosystems and animals and biodiversity. So you need to be able to split them up really and just be able to vocalise it in terms of either animals or humans, because sometimes they will try to trip you up with that. So let's focus on flooding, extreme weather and changes in rainfall. So where does flooding come from? The Earth's surface, the temperature increases, the ice caps melt. Ice caps melt, sea levels rise. And if sea levels rise, anywhere next to the coast is going to end up underwater. That's a problem for humans because human settlements are going to get flooded. If you're an animal, you're going to lose your habitat. That's bad as well. The second one we're talking about is extreme weather. It makes extreme weather more common. If you're a human, that causes damage. It can cause people to lose their homes, can cause death. If you're an animal, it can destroy your habitat. It can destroy ecosystems. It can destroy plants. It can disrupt food chains. Changes in rainfall, basically how much does it rain, where does it rain, when does it rain. If you're a human, a drought can prevent you growing crops. That can lead to food shortages and famine. But on the flip side, heavy rain is pretty bad for some crops too, and heavy rain can damage them, again affecting food production, again causing famine. Link it to animals, that's affecting their food sources, can disrupt food chains, can damage ecosystems. Last one we need to think about, this is exclusively talking about impact on animals, but it can lead to extinction of certain species. So as climate changes rapidly, animals and plants can't adapt fast enough and they'll start to die out. For example, if you're a polar bear and you rely on the ice to hunt and the ice disappears, you can't hunt, you won't survive. They can't adapt quick enough. That will lead to extinction over time. If species start to disappear, that's going to impact the biodiversity. It's going to make it decrease. So that's just a quick recap of the entire topic. What I'd like you to do, there's some past paper questions at the end of the booklet. I'd like you to have a go at them. As always, you need to complete this week's Educate quiz. You also need to send this booklet completed back to your teacher. And please do use the answer booklet to mark your answers. And we need to see that you've self-assessed them and that you've recognised what your weaknesses are and that you've improved them.